He thought a quiet black man reading in the park was a threat. Officer Richard Callan had spent decades letting suspicion guide his badge, and that day he saw Nathaniel Brooks and assumed guilt wrapped in silence. He didn't see a federal agent. He didn't see a man with a lifetime of service and dignity. He saw someone to question, to detain, to break. But when they picked Nathaniel Brooks, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know he was a special agent of the United States government, trained to see through intimidation, forged by decades of walking the fine line between restraint and righteousness. What came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning that shook the very foundation of a precinct built on quiet bias. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. The sun filtered through the tall windows of the precinct hallway, casting long, thin shadows across the tiled floor. Somewhere beyond the glass, a city moved on, unaware that behind one closed office door, a career was ending, and a new conversation about justice had already begun. Nathaniel Brooks wasn't doing anything unusual when it all began. A man in his early 40s with a quiet strength and a pair of reading glasses that had seen their share of long nights. He sat alone on a weathered park bench beneath the arms of a sprawling sycamore. The book in his hands, The Souls of Black Folk, rested gently across his lap, a page half turned as the breeze teased its edges. Children's laughter echoed from the nearby swings. Dogs barked in the distance, and somewhere down the path, a saxophone hummed softly from a busker's soul. For Nathaniel, this was his ritual, a sliver of stillness carved from a life that didn't always allow for it. But that afternoon, something changed. He felt it first as a prickle at the back of his neck, a familiar tension that didn't come from the pages, but from the stare of a man across the path. Officer Richard Callan had seen a lot in his 20 years on the force, and somewhere along the way that experience twisted into something else, an instinct that didn't protect, but profiled. He watched Nathaniel too long, too hard, a black man sitting alone, too calm. That was all it took. Officer Collins' hand hovered near his baton, not because of any threat, but because of a story he had already written in his head. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? When a moment of peace becomes a moment of suspicion. As Nathaniel looked up and met the officer's gaze, he didn't flinch. He had lived too many versions of this scene already. Still, something about this man's stare made his heart tighten, not in fear, but in weariness. How many times must dignity be confused for defiance? How many times must stillness be mistaken for guilt? The air between them thickened, slow and electric. And then the officer took a step forward. Tell me, if you were sitting in Nathaniel's place, just reading a book under the afternoon sun, what would you have done when that uniformed shadow began to fall over you? Officer Callan's boots crunched louder than necessary against the gravel path as he approached, each step a warning cloaked in protocol. Nathaniel didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't fumble with his book, didn't shrink beneath the stare. His hands remained visible, resting calmly over the cover, a silent negotiation already in progress. "Afternoon," Cullen said, his voice clipped, polite only in structure. "Afternoon," Nathaniel replied, tone even, steady, but not deferential. That unsettled the officer more than he'd expected. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here today?" Callan continued, eyes scanning Nathaniel's clothes, the book, the absence of anything that could be labeled suspicious. "Just enjoying the park," Nathaniel said, offering a soft smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's a public space, isn't it?" There was no edge in his voice, only the kind of clarity that people in his position had learned to use as armor. Callan's brow furrowed, the narrative in his head already spiraling. "You from around here?" he asked, fishing. "I've been around," Nathaniel answered. It was true but vague, and for Callan that was reason enough. The pause stretched thin. "Let me see some ID." That was it, the moment. Nathaniel's jaw tensed just slightly. Am I being detained? He asked. And it wasn't bravado, just fact. The officer's fingers brushed his holster, a warning wrapped in leather and silence. You will be if you don't cooperate. And there it was. The game had changed. The rules had shifted. The officer saw defiance. Nathaniel saw dignity. Still, he weighed the moment carefully. Escalation was always waiting, always hungry. So, with slow, deliberate movement, Nathaniel reached into his jacket and handed over his wallet. His heart wasn't racing. His soul was. What do you do when you're forced to justify your presence on a bench you've sat on for years? Officer Collins snatched the ID without looking at it closely, because the name meant nothing. The decision had already been made. As he ordered Nathaniel to stand and turn around, hands tightening around the cuffs, the air around them shifted from suspicion to humiliation. And in that moment, under that same tree where peace once lived, a man's freedom was stolen by a glance that refused to see his humanity. Why is it that silence is never enough to prove innocence? The silence inside the squad car was thick, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the rattle of handcuffs biting into Nathaniel's wrists. He stared out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of steel and sunlight, his expression unreadable. Officer Collin drove in rigid silence, his grip on the wheel white-knuckled, not from fear, but from the need to feel in control. But there was something about the man in the back seat that unsettled him. Nathaniel hadn't begged, hadn't yelled, hadn't even asked why. He had simply complied, with the precision of a man who had lived this before. That composure, that eerie calm, gnawed at Callan. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, glancing into the rearview mirror. Nathaniel met his eyes through the glass. "I told you, I was reading." The simplicity of the answer stung. "A guy like you?" Callan scoffed, catching himself too late. "A guy like me?" Nathaniel repeated, voice level. The weight of those 4 words lingered in the cabin like a question with no safe answer. Callan didn't respond. He couldn't. His own prejudice had just spoken louder than his badge. What happens when the man behind the wheel starts to realize the story he told himself doesn't hold up? As they pulled into the precinct, the tension sharpened. Callan yanked open the door and led Nathaniel inside, ignoring the glances from other officers. At the booking desk, Officer Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity in the park," Callan said, handing over the ID. Jenkins barely glanced at it, until he saw the name. His eyes flicked to Nathaniel, recognition blooming and then quickly masked. "Take him to Captain Torres," Jenkins said, handing the ID back, his tone clipped. Callan stiffened. Captain Torres didn't tolerate flimsy arrests. Still he nodded and led Nathaniel down the hallway. Each step toward her office felt heavier. Something was unraveling, and Callan could feel it in his bones. Had he just arrested someone more powerful than he realized? Or worse, had he just exposed something about himself he couldn't take back? Captain Elena Torres looked up from her desk as the door opened, her sharp eyes flicking from the paperwork to the scene in front of her. Officer Callan standing stiffly, and beside him, a handcuffed Nathaniel Brooks, whose calm presence filled the room like a quiet storm. "Captain," Callan began, voice tight, "this man was acting suspicious in the park. Refused to give ID. I brought him in for questioning." Torres didn't respond right away. She simply looked at Nathaniel, and in that brief pause, the air shifted. She knew who he was. The flicker of recognition crossed her face and was gone in an instant, replaced by a professional mask honed over years of navigating both justice and politics. "Did you have probable cause to detain him?" she asked, her voice cool, deliberate. Callan hesitated. "He matched a vague description," he said, though even he knew how hollow it sounded. Torres didn't blink. "Officer Callan, wait outside." Her tone left no room for argument. Callan clenched his jaw, reluctant but obeyed. The moment the door clicked shut, Torres's demeanor softened. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, "I'm deeply sorry for this." Nathaniel allowed himself a small nod. "You're just doing your job, Captain." She sighed, eyes drifting to the closed door. I know who you are, but I'd like to keep that quiet for now while I handle this internally. Nathaniel's expression hardened, the weight of the moment returning. I didn't tell him who I was because it shouldn't have to matter. My rights shouldn't hinge on a title. Torres nodded slowly. You're right, but sometimes reality demands strategy. There was a long silence between them, heavy with unspoken truth. Then she stood. Let me bring him back in. We'll clear this now. As she opened the door and Callan stepped back inside, the power dynamic had quietly flipped. He could sense it, though he didn't yet understand why. Mr. Brooks is not the man you're looking for, Torres said firmly. Release him immediately. The words hit Callan like a slap. But, Captain, now! He fumbled with the keys, unlocking the cuffs with shaking hands. Nathaniel didn't gloat, didn't glare. He simply rubbed his wrists and looked Callan in the eye. You should ask yourself, he said quietly, what made you think I didn't belong there? And in that stillness, could you feel the question echo? The precinct conference room felt colder than usual. The kind of cold that didn't come from air conditioning, but from tension thick in the walls. Officer Collins sat at one end of the long table, his uniform crisp, his posture defensive. On the other side sat Nathaniel Brooks, no longer a suspect, no longer anonymous. Today he was seated not as a detainee, but as a federal agent, a special investigator with the authority to be there and the composure to dominate the room without raising his voice. Captain Torres opened the meeting with a voice as sharp as her stare. This review is to determine whether Officer Callan's actions were appropriate during the detainment of Special Agent Brooks. Callan stiffened. The title hit like a hammer. Special Agent. The magnitude of his mistake began to settle in, inch by inch. Officer, Torres continued, you claimed Agent Brooks matched a suspect's description. Can you elaborate? Callan hesitated. He was sitting alone, quiet, avoiding eye contact. He fit the profile. What profile? Asked one of the internal affairs officers. Callan opened his mouth, then shut it. His reasoning, once so certain, now crumbled under scrutiny. Then Nathaniel spoke, his voice calm, each word deliberate. I was reading The Souls of Black Folk in a public park. That was the only profile I fit. The silence was suffocating. Did you consider that your judgment might have been clouded by bias? One official asked. Callan's jaw clenched. That wasn't my intention. Intentions don't excuse consequences, Nathaniel said. His words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the burden of assumptions. How many more men like me are stopped for doing what others take for granted? He asked the room. Tell me, when does just doing your job become something else entirely? Callan looked down, no longer able to meet Nathaniel's eyes. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavier than ever. Around the table, heads nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of an uncomfortable truth now fully exposed. The final decision came down like a quiet verdict. No dramatic slamming of gavels, no raised voices, just Captain Torres, standing in her office with the termination letter in her hand and a weight in her voice that made it clear this wasn't just administrative. Officer Richard Callan stood across from her, no longer in uniform but in plain clothes, a cardboard box tucked awkwardly beneath one arm. It's official, she said, placing the letter gently on the desk between them. Your employment with the department is terminated, effective immediately. Callan didn't argue. The fire that once lit his eyes was gone, replaced by something quieter. Regret, maybe. He gave a slow nod, swallowing hard. I didn't mean to, he started, then stopped. He knew better. Meaning well hadn't stopped him from humiliating a man in front of strangers, and it hadn't stopped justice from finding its way back around. A soft knock interrupted the silence as Nathaniel Brooks stepped into the room. His expression, as always, was calm, but there was a gravity to it that made even Callan look away. "Mr. Brooks," Callan said quietly, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this." Nathaniel didn't move, didn't soften. "It's not about fixing it," he replied. "It's about learning why it happened and making sure it doesn't happen again." His tone wasn't cruel, but it didn't leave space for excuses either. "You've been given a consequence," he added. "Now comes the choice. Will you let it break you or reshape you? Do you think everyone deserves a second chance, even when their actions cause harm?" Torres glanced between the two men, her own face heavy with the responsibility of what came next, not just for Callan, but for the department as a whole. Reforms had already begun. Workshops on racial bias were scheduled. Protocols were being rewritten. But change wasn't a memo. It was a culture shift, and that shift would take more than policies. As Callan turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back one last time. "Good luck," he said. Not out of politeness, but necessity. And when the door clicked shut behind him, Nathaniel and Torres stood in the quiet that followed, knowing full well this was only the beginning. Real change, after all, doesn't come from punishment. It comes from resolve. Sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one that lives quietly inside us. The assumptions we carry, the stories we tell ourselves about people we don't really know. This story reminds us that dignity doesn't always wear a uniform, and justice doesn't always arrive with flashing lights. Nathaniel Brooks didn't shout or fight back. He stood firm in who he was, letting truth speak louder than anger. And in doing so, he reminded us of something timeless. How we treat others, especially in moments of power, reveals who we truly are. As we get older, we've seen the world change in many ways, but the most meaningful change often begins with small moments of reflection. Have we ever looked past someone without really seeing them? Have we ever misjudged someone out of habit, not malice? There's no shame in asking these questions, only strength in facing them. Because it's never too late to grow, to understand, and to choose a better way forward. Respect, after all, is not just a gift we give others. It's a reflection of the values we choose to carry. Nathaniel Brooks didn't leave the precinct with a crowd or applause. He walked out alone, the morning air cool against his skin, his steps measured and steady. But in that quiet, there was power, the kind that comes from knowing you faced injustice and didn't let it define you. He didn't raise his voice to be heard. He stood in his truth and let the system catch up, and slowly it began to. Behind those walls, new policies were being written, officers retrained, conversations once avoided now unfolding in break rooms and briefing halls. What happened to Nathaniel couldn't be undone, but it could be transformed, because when truth is spoken, even softly, it echoes. And those echoes have the power to reach places that silence once ruled. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.